coming. I'm Ed Rosario, the oldest son of Maria and Federico. And I don't have the privilege of living in this wonderful state of Florida that you guys live in with all the sunshine. I live in the Four Seasons, Spokane, Washington. And I didn't just get there by chance. I spent 26 years active duty in the military, and that's where I finally retired, was in Spokane, Washington. The good thing about it is that Spokane is a place with four seasons, like some of you are probably familiar with. And it's a nice place to raise your kids. The bad part is I miss my family. I have a wonderful family. And so that's the downside. But you don't want to talk about me, you want to talk about my mother. Maria Antonia Roldan Rosario. My mother was a very beautiful woman. My mother was affectionately known by her family and friends as Toñita. And that's what my father called her. That's what all family members called her, just short for Antonia. I had a very close relationship with my mom because I was the firstborn, and also because I was actually, that's incorrect, I wasn't the firstborn. I was the first surviving son. My mother had two children before I was born. My mother had a daughter, Nilda Estel, born, lived a few months, and she died of an illness. My mother's second pregnancy was a son, born at full term, but didn't survive very long. They named him Federico after my father. Mommy loved her children. Mommy, then I was born, the surviving son, and following me was 6 more. So it was 7 children. And Mommy loved us all with tenacity, with love like a mother hen and her chicks. She cared for us, she cradled us and kept us warm, comfortable, and safe. And sometimes when one of us got sick, my mom would frantically ask my father, he's sick, he needs to go to the doctor, she needs to go to the doctor, there's something wrong with him. And my father, being the frugal, practical person that he was, would say, he's okay, she's all right. Give him an aspirin, put him to bed, and let him get some bread, they'll be all right. And 90% of the time it worked. But my mother would really get frantic about it. She always worried about us when we got sick. Mommy and Papi, that's what I call them, and my brothers and sisters did too. They loved each other with a love that's out of this world. They were a true love story. My father loved music. My father would play music. And now and then he'd stand up and grab my mother and want to dance. Sometimes he even danced with her without music. He'd just pick her up to get out and dance. Father loved my mother. He loved her with a love that I'll never forget, because that's what made me want to marry and have children. I wanted to emulate my dad. I was in the Air Force, as I said before, and Mom and Dad came to visit me. I was stationed at Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire. Talk about Spokane. New Hampshire's even colder. And Pease, my mom and dad came, and actually my brother Richard was there, my brother Freddie, and we played dominoes, and we barbecued, and we ate. And after the meal, Mom and Dad went out in the field, out in the grass, and I'll never forget, because I saw Mommy sit down in the lawn, then I saw Daddy lay down in the lawn and put his head in her lap, and they just went away by themselves, away from the family, just to be alone. And then you'd see Mommy stroking his hair. Just the passion was just out of this world. I'd say a true love story. Before I was in the Air Force, I actually was in the Army. So I spent 3 years active duty in the Army. I left for the Army when I was very young. after 3 years in the Army, I separated and came back home to New York. And to my utter surprise, my mother, 41 years old, was pregnant with her. Yvette is 21 years younger than me. And so I returned from the Army after having served 3 years, and Mommy was pregnant. And what a bundle of joy. Mommy had Yvette when she was 42 years old. But perhaps that's a good thing, because while Yvette was growing up, most of us were leaving. And Yvette wound up to be sort of like an only child and get spoiled by Mom and Dad. My mother was the person who most inspired me to love the Lord. She introduced me to my faith. My mother would, when I was a youngster, I'm talking 9, 10 years old, 8 years old maybe. I have a brother who's passed away since, but my brother and I would share a room, and we had twin beds, and my mother would come to our room, and she'd sit at either one of her bed or my bed, and she'd start reading the Bible. And she'd read the Bible to us, and she'd tell us stories about the Lord. And she'd tell us about the Lord's crucifixion. And when she did that, she actually cried. Telling us the story, she'd shed tears. And it was such a... And she talked about the cruelty, how the Romans beat him with a whip and then crucified him. And it was so touching, and so that it just inspired me to want to follow this faith. And that was my mother. She did that often. We'd come and talk to us about the Bible. And that, like I said, made a big deal to me. Mom once told me that, or told us, I'm sure she probably told all of us, that she was visited by an angel. And that when she says that, when she talked about that experience, she'd get goose pimples. Her hair was stand up in her arms. She'd say, "Mira cómo se me paran los pelos," telling us about this angel's visit. In 1969, my mother developed cervical cancer. That was a tough one. 69, cancer was not easily cured. And so she had cobalt radiation, very painful radiation, and but she survived. And that cancer was never to return again. So that was 69. After my father's death in 2006, Mommy began, well, she was already experiencing dementia, but she started progressively moving real fast towards Alzheimer's. And eventually wound up being placed in the John Knox Majestic Oaks Memory Wing because of her Alzheimer's, because she could no longer do things for herself, and that was very difficult for the family to have her be at the nursing home. Well, she was a resident there for approximately 3 years, but a resident only in the terms that she lived there. She was not bedridden, and she had a run of the place, and every aide, every nurse, every person who worked in that wing would see her running all around the wing. I mean, she'd walk from here to there. You could never find her in the room. She was always all over the place. In fact, my wife and I would go visit, and we'd go to her room. She's not there. And we'd go ask the nurse, one of the aides, "Have you seen Maria?" We saw her a little while ago. She was somewhere over there. We'd have to find her. And then we'd find her, and we'd either find her in another resident's room or in one of the mock scenes that they have at kitchens and nurseries, etc. And one of the aides once told me, she says, "You know, I couldn't find Maria. And when we finally found her, and she was in the mock nursery in a crib. How she got in there, I don't know. There was 2, 3 of us to get her out." After I retired from work, my wife and I bought a big RV. We bought a 38-foot fifth wheel. And one of our first trips was here to Florida with our fifth wheel. And we parked our fifth wheel here at the Orange City RV Resort. And then Mommy's was still living at the house. So I asked Mom if she wanted to see our fifth wheel. Well, she said, sure. So we took her to the fifth wheel at the Garden City Resort, and we gave her a tour. I gave her a tour of the fifth wheel. And afterwards I says, well, what do you think, Mom? She says, I like it. It's nice. But I think you ought to add another room. I said, you think? And every summer, for as long as Mom and Dad lived here in Deltona, every summer I would visit Deltona without fail. I visit to spend a little time with them, and just being the absent son that I was. I'd like to come home and help in whatever way I could. I would always trim the hedges. That was my specialty. I would sculpture their hedges, I call it. And I would mow their lawn and edge, and if they needed some work inside the house, I would do it. And I felt real good about it. I remember my mother often would come out and see me in the hot sun and say, hey, you need to come inside. Get out of the hot sun. So I'd say, I'm enjoying it. This is exercise for me, Mom. So she'd say, well, you really should get out of the sun. I said, look, Mom, why don't you get me a glass of lemonade. They had a lemon tree in the backyard. Had some great lemons. And Mommy made great lemonade, so she'd fix me a nice ice-cold glass of lemonade, bring it to me, and that was me. I was enjoying myself. I didn't mind the sun all that much. Mommy was also a very hard worker. I'd say not only a hard worker, but my dad's assistant. She did everything my dad wanted her to do, and she did it. He didn't care how hard the work was, she just did it. After my father retired from the New York City Housing Authority, they moved to Puerto Rico. And my father, those of you that, I don't know how many of you knew my father was a very industrious person. You could not keep my father retired. And so my father bought a field in Puerto Rico, and in this field, he decided he was going to plant yucca. I don't know if you're familiar with yucca. Yucca is a root that we use in Puerto Rico and in the States too. Anyway, so he planted yucca, but before he can plant the yucca, they had to clear the field, and they had to cultivate it, and then they had to plant the yucca. Well, my mother and my father did this together. And I remember my mom saying, you know what, I never worked so hard in my whole life as I did working that field with Dad. Something else about my mother. My mother, her passion was flowers. She loved flowers, and no matter where Mommy lived, whether it's New York. In New York, we had a hydrangea bush in the front yard. It was the most gorgeous bush. Richie might remember it, Freddie. It had the biggest blooms, big blooms, and the blooms would bloom light green, and then turn yellow, and they turn blue, and they turn pink, and they were just gorgeous blooms. And Mommy loved to sit by the hydrangea bush and get a photograph taken, which was appropriate because in my estimation, she was one of those flowers. In Puerto Rico, she had, when she lived there, she had a beautiful rose garden. And I don't know how many of you knew my mother when she lived here in Deltona, on Coronet. Right, her yard looked like a botanical garden. She had roses of every color and variety. She had all kinds of plants with mixed colors all over the place. People would walk by and stare at the yard. They couldn't help but look in the yard. It was so pretty. Loved those flowers. Most of all, Mommy loved Daddy. She loved the kids, but she loved Daddy. Theirs was a true love story. Both my mother and my father, they adored one another. They were made for each other. That's why I think Mommy really slipped into that Alzheimer's quickly after Daddy died. Maybe she didn't want to suffer the loneliness, the absence of the man of her life. So I'd say, I love you, Mommy. And Papi, she's back with you now. And I would add, save me a place, because I'm coming one of these days. And I love her and my dad forever. And I'd like to close with my mom's favorite psalm. And she actually told me once, she said, Eddie, when I die, I want you to sing Psalm 23 for me. Honestly, you don't want to hear me sing Psalm 23. so I'm going to recite it. The Lord is my shepherd. There is nothing I shall want. In verdant pastures he gives me repose. Besides restful waters he leads me. He refreshes my soul. He guides me in the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk in that dark valley, I fear no evil, for you are at my side, with your rod and your staff that gives me courage. You spread the table before me in the sight of my foes. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Only goodness and kindness follow me all the days of my life. I will dwell in the house of the Lord for years to come. Thank you for being here.